Such were the joys. An essay written by George Orwell sometime in the early 1940s, some many years after he had been to prep school. It was not published until 1954, I believe, long after he had died, and also long after the headmaster and the headmistress of the school that he went to had also died. Had it been published prior to that, the estate might have been brought up, or it might have had a libel. Um, it was a somewhat libelous essay. Anyway, here we go. Soon after I arrived at St. Cyprian's, not immediately, but after a week or two, just when I seemed to be settling into the routine of school life, I began wetting my bed. I was now aged 8, so that this was a reversion to a habit which I must have grown out of at least 4 years earlier. Nowadays, I believe bedwetting in such circumstances is taken for granted. It's a normal reaction in children who have been removed from their homes to a strange place. In those days, however, it was looked upon as a disgusting crime, which the child committed on purpose, and for which a proper cure was a beating. For my part, I did not need to be told it was a crime. Night after night I prayed with a fervour never previously attained in my prayers. Please God, do not let me wet my bed. Oh, please God, do not let me wet my bed. It made remarkably little difference. Some nights the thing happened, others not. There was no volition about it, no consciousness. You did not, properly speaking, do the deed. You merely woke up in the morning and found that the sheets were wringing wet. After the second or third offence, I was warned that I should be beaten the next time, and I received the warning in a curiously roundabout way. One afternoon, as we were filing out from tea, Mrs. Wilkes, the headmaster's wife, was sitting at the head of one of the tables, chatting with a lady of whom I knew nothing, except that she was on an afternoon's visit to the school. She was an intimidating, masculine-looking person wearing a riding habit, or something that I took to be a riding habit. I was just leaving the room when Mrs. Wilkes called me back, as though to introduce me to the visitor. Mrs. Wilkes was nicknamed Flip, and I shall call her by that name, for I seldom think of her by any other. Officially, however, she was addressed as Mum, probably a corruption of Ma'am, used by public school boys to their housemasters' wives. She was a stocky, square-built woman with hard red cheeks, a flat top to her head, prominent brows, and deep-set, suspicious eyes. Although a great deal of the time she was full of false heartiness, jollying one along with mannish slang, "Buck up, old chap," and so forth, and even using one's Christian name. Her eyes never lost their anxious, accusing look. It was very difficult to look at her in the face without feeling guilty, even at moments when one was not guilty of anything in particular. "Here is a little boy," said Flip, indicating me to the strange lady, "who wets his bed every night. Do you know what I'm going to do if you wet your bed again?" she added, turning to me. "I'm going to get the sixth form to beat you." The strange lady put on an air of being inexpressibly shocked, and exclaimed, "I should think so." And here occurred one of those wild, almost lunatic misunderstandings which are part of daily experience of childhood. The sixth form were a group of older boys who were selected as having character, and were empowered to beat smaller boys. I had not yet learned of their existence, and I misheard the phrase "the sixth form" as "Mrs. Form." I took it as referring to the strange lady. I thought, that is, that her name was Mrs. Form. It's an improbable name, but a child has no judgment in such matters. I imagined, therefore, that it was she who had been deputed to beat me. It did not strike me as strange that this job should be turned over to a casual visitor, in no way connected with the school. I merely assumed that Mrs. Form was a stern disciplinarian who enjoyed beating people. Somehow her appearance seemed to bear this out, and I had an immediate terrifying vision of her arriving for the occasion, full riding kit, and armed with a hunting whip. To this day I can feel myself almost swooning with shame as I stood, a very small, round-faced boy in short corduroy trousers, before the two women. I could not speak. I felt that I should die if Mrs. Form were to beat me. But my dominant feeling was not of fear or even resentment. It was simply shame because one more person, and that a woman, had been told of my disgusting offence. A little later, I forgot how I learned that it was not after all Mrs. Form who would be doing the beating. I cannot remember whether it was that very night that I wet the bed again. At any rate, I did wet it quite soon. Oh, the despair, the feeling of cruel injustice, after all my prayers and resolutions, at once again waking between the clammy sheets. There was no chance of hiding what I had done. The grim, statuesque matron, Margaret by name, arrived in the dormitory, specially to inspect my bed. She pulled back the clothes, then drew herself up, and the dreaded words seemed to come rolling out of her like a peal of thunder. "Report yourself to the headmaster after breakfast." I put "report yourself" in capitals, because that is how it appeared to my mind. I do not know how many times I heard that phrase during my early years at St. Cyprian's. I was only very rarely that it did not mean a beating. The words always had a portentous sound in my ears, like muffled drums, or the words of the death sentence. When I arrived to report myself, Flip was doing something or other at the long shiny table in the anteroom to the study. Her uneasy eyes searched me as I went past. In the study, Mr. Wilkes, nicknamed Sambo, was waiting. Sambo was round-shouldered, curiously oafish-looking man, not large but shambling in gait, with a chubby face, which was like that of an overgrown baby, and which was capable of good humour. He knew, of course, why I had been sent to him, and he already taken a bone-handled riding-crop out of the cupboard. But it was part of the punishment of reporting yourself that you had to proclaim your offence with your own lips. When I had my say, he read me a short but pompous lecture, then seized me by the scruff of the neck, twisted me over, and began beating me with the riding-crop. He had of continuing his lecture while I flogged you, and I remember the words, "You dirty little boy," keeping time with the blows. The beating did not hurt. Perhaps, as it was the first time, he was not hitting me very hard, and I walked out feeling very much better. The fact that the beating had not hurt was a sort of victory, and partially wiped out the shame of bedwetting. Perhaps I was even incautious enough to wear a grin on my face. Some small boys were hanging about in the passage outside the door of the anteroom. "Did you get the cane?" "It didn't hurt," I said proudly. Flip had heard everything. Instantly her voice came screaming after me. Come here this instant. What was that you said?" "I said it didn't hurt," I faltered out. "How dare you say a thing like that? Do you think this is a proper thing to say? Go in and report yourself again." This time Sambo laid on in real earnest. He continued for a length of time that frightened and astonished me. About 5 minutes it seemed, ending up breaking the riding crop. The bone handle went flying across the room. "Look what you made me do," he said furiously, holding the broken crop. I'd fallen into a chair, weakly snivelling. I remember that this was the only time throughout my boyhood when a beating actually reduced me to tears, and curiously enough, I was not now even crying because of the pain. The second beating had not hurt very much. Fright and shame seemed to have anaesthetized me. I was crying partly because I felt that this was expected of me, partly from genuine repentance, but partly also because of a deeper grief which is peculiar to childhood and not easy to convey, a sense of desolate loneliness and helplessness of being locked up not only in a hostile world, but in a world of good and evil, where the rules were such that it was actually not possible for me to keep them. I knew that the bedwetting was A, wicked, and B, outside my control. The second fact I was personally aware of, and the first I did not question. It was possible, therefore, to commit a sin without knowing that you had committed it, without wanting to commit it, and without being able to avoid it. Sin was not necessarily something that you did. It might be something that happened to you. I do not want to claim that this idea flashed into my mind as a complete novelty at this very moment, under the blows of Sambo's cane. I must have had glimpses of it even before I left home, for my early childhood had not been altogether happy. But at any rate, this was the great abiding lesson of my boyhood, that I was in a world where it was not possible for me to be good, and the double beating was the turning point. For it brought home to me for the first time the harshness of the environment into which I had been flung. Life was more terrible, and I was more wicked than I had imagined. At any rate, as I sat snivelling on the edge of the chair in Sambo's study, with not even the self-possession to stand up while he stormed at me, I had a conviction of sin and folly and weakness, such I do not remember to have felt before. In general, one's memories of any period must necessarily weaken as one moves away from it. One is constantly learning new facts, and old ones have to drop out to make way for them. At 20, I could have written the history of my school days with an accuracy which would be quite impossible now. But it can also happen that one's memories grow sharper after a long lapse of time, because one is looking at the past with fresh eyes and can isolate and, as it were, notice facts which previously existed undifferentiated amongst the mass of others. Here are two things which, in a sense, I remembered, but which did not strike me as strange or interesting until quite recently. One is that the second beating seemed to me a just and reasonable punishment. To get one beating and then to get another, and a far fiercer one on top of it, for being so unwise as to show that the first one had not hurt. That was quite natural. The gods are jealous, and when you have the good fortune, you should conceal it. The other is that I accepted the broken riding crop as my own crime. I can still recall my feelings as I saw the handle lying on the carpet, the feeling of having done an ill-bred, clumsy thing and ruined an expensive object. I had broken it. So Sambo told me, so I believed. This acceptance of guilt lay unnoticed in my memory for 20 or 30 years. So much for the episode of bedwetting. There is one more thing to be remarked. That is, that I did not wet my bed again. At least, I did wet it once again and received another beating, after which the trouble stopped. So perhaps this barbarous remedy does work, although at a heavy price, I have no doubt.